Hey guys, welcome back to Muddy York. Today, we're commemorating one of the most powerful and devastating events in Toronto's history, Hurricane Hazel. 69 years ago, on October 15th, 1954, Hazel tore through the city, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. It was a storm that changed Toronto forever, reshaping how we prepare for and manage natural disasters. To mark this anniversary, we are re-releasing our special episode on Hurricane Hazel. In this episode, we dive into the storm's origins, its impact on Toronto, and how it tested the city's resilience. You'll hear the stories of those who lived through it and learn about the aftermath that led to sweeping changes in flood management and infrastructure planning. Whether you're hearing this episode for the first time or revisiting it, it's a stark reminder of the city's history and the strength of its people. Let's take a moment to reflect on how far we've come since Hazel's fierce winds swept through our streets. This is Muddy York. Let's go.
If you walk to the Bloor Street Bridge running over the Humber River, you can see a marker on one of the pillars representing the river's high water mark during Hurricane Hazel. It's more than 8 meters above ground. Over the course of 24 hours in 1954, Hurricane Hazel would drop an estimated 40 billion gallons of water on southern Ontario. It would transform usually peaceful streams into raging torrents of water that washed away anything in its path, including cars, homes, and people. By the time the storm left, 81 people were dead, and more than 4,000 would be left homeless. In this episode, we're going to tell the story of Hurricane Hazel, one of the worst disasters to ever strike Toronto. This is Muddy York.
Hurricanes don't hit Toronto. Everyone knows that. Hurricanes happen in Florida or Texas. One might occasionally strike Atlantic Canada, but not Toronto. It's like a snowstorm in Jamaica. But it happened. People sometimes think of Hurricane Hazel as a Toronto disaster. Hundreds of people had died before it made it to Toronto. Hazel began in Hurricane Alley, an area of warm water in the Atlantic that produces many of the hurricanes that strike North America. Storm watchers would spot her on October 5th, and it would wreak havoc for the next 2 weeks. After passing into the Caribbean, Hazel would kill 9 people in Puerto Rico. However, Haiti suffered the most. By now, Hazel was a Category 3 hurricane, meaning that it had sustained winds of more than 190 kilometers an hour. Flash floods and landslides would destroy whole villages. The Haitian death toll was at least 400 and may have been as high as 1,000. Another 7 people would die in Cuba and the Bahamas as Hazel moved north. Hurricanes usually lose strength as they move north because of lower water temperatures, but Hazel would follow the Gulf Stream, which is a warm ocean current running up the east coast of North America. By the time it had reached the Carolinas on the morning of October 15th, Hazel had actually strengthened to a Category 4 hurricane. There are only 5 hurricane categories, so that gives you a sense of how powerful this storm was. The hurricane produced a storm surge of more than 18 feet, causing massive damage along the coast. According to the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, every pier for a distance of 170 miles was demolished. In Long Beach, North Carolina, only 5 of the 357 buildings were left standing. Hazel is still remembered as one of the most destructive hurricanes in North Carolina's history. From there, the storm headed north through Virginia, where 80 ships from the U.S. Navy base at Norfolk were forced to hastily put to sea to avoid the storm. As it passed over Philadelphia, Hazel tore an incomplete battleship free from its moorings and set it adrift on the Delaware River. In New York City, a wind gust of 182 kilometers an hour would be recorded, the highest wind speed ever recorded in New York. As Hazel headed north over Lake Ontario in the late evening, 95 Americans were dead. But the ordeal wasn't over yet.
Hurricanes will sometimes make their way up the East Coast, but they rarely head inland. When they do, they usually lose power over land, especially when passing over high elevations like the Allegheny Mountains in Pennsylvania. The same thing happened with Hazel. The difference was that it would encounter a cold front moving east. Some meteorologists even argue that the original hurricane dissolved over New York, and that Hazel's remains merged with this cold front to create a new storm. They call it Hazel 2. However you want to describe the process, the encounter with the cold front was like pouring gasoline on a dying fire. The end result was that a storm called Hazel was moving towards Toronto, quote, a city that had never known even a slowing hurricane, in an area where no hurricane had a logical right to be. In the aftermath of Hurricane Hazel, one of the big debates was about whether the city had been warned in advance. At the time, most Torontonians said that they knew nothing about Hazel until the rain started falling. But the Public Weather Office had issued 2 official bulletins about Hazel during the day, and the senior officer at the local weather station did multiple radio interviews. At the time, radio was still the dominant media in Toronto. So why were so many oblivious to the danger? It probably had something to do with the language that the weather office used. Let me give you an example. This is the text from the official forecast issued at 9:30 in the evening, just before Hazel came ashore. Hurricane Hazel, which moved in on the North Carolina coast Friday morning, continued to move northward and to accelerate during the day, and by 9 p.m. was centered between Buffalo and Rochester. The intensity of this storm has decreased to the point where it should no longer be classified as a hurricane. This weakening storm will continue northward, passing just east of Toronto before midnight. The main rainfall associated with it should end shortly thereafter, with occasional light rain occurring during the night. Winds will increase slightly to 45 to 50 miles per hour until about midnight, then slowly decrease throughout the remainder of the night. Everything about this report is low-key and scientific. Somebody who lived in a hurricane zone might understand the implications of these events, the same way that a Torontonian understands the implications if a weather report calls for 7 inches of snow. But the average person had no idea what it all meant.
We should also discuss what had been happening in Toronto for the last couple of weeks. The short version is that it had been raining a whole lot. In fact, it had been one of the rainiest falls on record. This was important because in the next 24 hours, Hazel would drop more than 7 inches of rain in Toronto, almost double the previous record. The ground was already waterlogged, so as much as 90% of that water would simply flow into rivers and creeks running downhill towards Toronto and Lake Ontario. At first, the rain and wind were just an annoyance, drenching pedestrians and creating hazardous driving conditions. One woman taking the bus home from work explained that the water in one of the gullies came up to the floor of the bus. After they reached higher ground, the driver had to stop and open the doors to let the water run out. Nancy Hubert has a great story. She was driving to Willowdale with her husband in a borrowed car. In her words, In the vicinity of the Golden Mile, my husband decided the driver's door was rattling rather alarmingly and probably not tightly closed, so he opened it to give it a good slam. Immediately, it was wrenched off its hinges and took off into space. Frantically aware of the face that this was a borrowed car, he was out in a flash, chasing the door until it came to a rest, leaning against a truck in the parking lot. What to do? It obviously had to be removed to a safe place. So, forgetting that he is rather short, slight man, he picked it up by his sides to try to get it back to the car. Of course, a tremendous gust came along at the worst possible moment, and suddenly there was the father of my children sailing through the air, madly clutching the doors as it carried him through space, and I was collapsed in helpless laughter, unable to even offer a small measure of help. When he finally came to rest, miraculously still on his feet, he found himself just outside the local drugstore, Tamblin's, I think, which was the only place still open in the plaza. He made his way inside, where he explained his predicament to the clerk and asked if he might leave the car door there until another day. As there was nothing in her rulebook to cover such exigencies, she decided it would probably be okay, these being unusual circumstances. So, between the two of them, they managed to wrestle the door inside and lean it up against a display case. Oh my.
For all of our listeners, Gray has been nominated for an award for his delivery of that dramatic monologue. Now, returning to 1954. As the rain kept falling and runoff flowed into local waterways, the rivers became swollen, bursting their banks and flooding anything nearby. Roads became impassable. If motorists were lucky, they would only be stranded. If they weren't lucky, they would have to make a mad dash for safety as the water rose around them. Not everybody made it. A telephone lineman named Gerald Elliott was trapped on a bridge over the Humber when the water washed away the bank on both sides. Firemen tried to pull him to safety with a hose wrapped around his waist, but the hose broke and he was swept away by the river. He managed to grab a tree branch and spent 4 hours clinging to that branch as multiple rescue attempts failed. Finally, a man named Max Hurley managed to navigate through the river in a rowboat, using broken trees as shelter from the current, and fallen branches to pull himself forward until he reached the stranded man. Elliot later said, "I don't see how I could have held on much longer. I thought I would drown for sure." Diane Senego would also get help when she needed it. "I was just a young girl sitting in the bus terminal at Glen Echo. The storm was raging and I was crying. It was after midnight, the rain was coming down so hard and it was so dark. A Wilson bus pulled into the station and the driver said, 'Never mind, little girl, I'll get you home.' Wilson Avenue was a river. We only knew where it was because of the telephone poles. In places, the driver had to leave the road and drive on the lawns. He got me home around 1:30 a.m.
The greatest destruction came from the flooding along the Humber. Much of the river is located on a floodplain. Today, it's mostly parkland. Much of it had been developed in the post-war years, with houses located right along the banks of the river. 2 years earlier, there had been a proposal to build some dams for flood control, but the plan was expensive and City Council said no. Woodbridge, located northwest of Toronto, was the first community to be affected. In a matter of hours, the Humber would swell from a width of 65 feet to more than 350 feet across. Under the weight of the water, an earthen dam would collapse, creating flash floods downstream. Some of the water burst the banks of the river, destroying 20 local houses and every single trailer in the Glendale Mobile Home Park, where 9 people would die. The rest of the water began surging to the south towards Weston, Swansea, and Long Branch. The greatest loss of life would be in Weston, along a street called Raymore Drive, located south of Lawrence between Jane and Royal York. It was a residential street built along the banks of the Humber with a swing bridge over the river supported with steel suspension cables. Springtime flooding was common, but nobody had ever been hurt, and most people didn't worry too much about the storm. As the river rose, the water also carried pieces of debris that had been swept away upriver. The pressure from the water and the impact from the debris as it collided with the bridge made it unstable. Finally, the western side of the bridge tore loose and collapsed into the water, but the eastern side stayed firm and the steel cables continued to hold the bridge in place. The result was that the bridge began redirecting the water from the Humber straight onto Raymore Drive. Eventually, the bridge itself would break free and become a battering ram, smashing into homes along the street. One witness said, "The homes were literally lifted off their foundation and swept away. You could hear people screaming. Many of them were standing on the roofs. In many cases, the screaming just stopped. The homes just disintegrated, and that was the end of it." 36 people from Raymore Drive would die that night. We've posted a picture online of the day after the storm, with the Raymore Drive street plan superimposed. It shows how 14 houses and more than a third of the street are gone, just erased by the water.
Further down the Humber, another tragedy was unfolding. At 1 a.m., 8 volunteer firemen had answered a call about 2 people stranded in their car along the river road between Dundas and Bloor. About a mile south of Dundas, they found that the road was washed out. They could see the stranded car, but the people were gone. Their fate is a complete mystery, even to this day. When the firemen tried to back up the truck, it became stuck in the mud, so they climbed onto the truck and planned to wait out the storm. One of them said later, "Well, what are you going to do? There's nothing behind us. You can't see the road anymore. The water is all around you." Firemen on shore tried to rescue them with a rowboat, but the water overturned it in seconds. One man waded out with a rope tied around his waist, trying to get to the truck, but the current knocked him over and he had to be dragged back to shore. Quote, "Obviously the water's coming up, eh? It ain't going down. It's just coming up." There wasn't much conversation, just a sorting out of who could swim and who couldn't, and divvying up of anything that would float. We're starting to float. We shook hands, then every man for himself. Police would rescue 2 of the firemen, and a third managed to swim to shore. The other 5 drowned. The truck would be found in the parking lot of the Old Mill restaurant nearly half a mile downstream.
While all this was happening in Toronto, Hazel was also wreaking havoc on the rest of southern Ontario. As the rain kept falling, any location near a pond or creek was likely to be flooded. Over 50 bridges across the province would be put out of commission. Multiple trains would derail after the tracks were washed out. Amazingly, only 2 people would die in these events. But the greatest damage would be in Holland Marsh, a bowl-shaped valley just south of Lake Simcoe. As the name would suggest, it was originally a marsh, but a major project during the 20s and 30s had drained much of it for farmland. Dutch immigrants would move in, and by 1954, there were 3,000 people living there. As the water from Lake Simcoe backed into the valley, the water level rose as much as 30 feet, flooding 7,000 acres of land. One resident said, "It wasn't like down by the Humber where there was a big rush of water. The water was really quiet, and it was so dark outside you couldn't really see what was going on. But every time you looked out the door, the water had risen another 6 inches."
The Deputer family had a truly incredible night. As the water rose, their house was lifted off its foundation and began to drift across the water. In the words of Henry Deputer, "The house just took off like a boat, a real Noah's Ark." From 11:30 till 6:30, we floated aimlessly through the marsh, bumping into houses, greenhouses, barns, hydro poles, everything. The area over by the Holland River had a faster current, and somehow our house got caught in that current and started spinning like a top, faster and faster and rocking to and fro. We all 15 of us, would run from one side of the house to the other when it tilted, trying to balance it out. One of my younger brothers, Bastian, actually got violently seasick. Eventually, their house came to rest on a service road near Highway 400. It had traveled 2.5 miles. The next day, Holland Marsh looked like one vast lake. We've posted some pictures on Facebook and Twitter so you can see for yourself.
The funny thing about the next day was that many people didn't realize what had happened during the night. If you lived away on high ground or your home was sheltered from the wind, then Hazel was just a bad thunderstorm. People awoke to a disaster scene. Everyday objects like clothes, toys, and furniture were scattered everywhere. Streetcars were lying on their side. Cars were buried in mud, sometimes miles from where they had been left. Along the Don River, quote, bridges were moved off their pilings and floated downstream until they came to the Bloor Street Viaduct. There, they jammed, and the result was one of the biggest piles of wood, trees, garbage anyone has ever seen. Months afterwards, work crews were busy burying the debris and looking for bodies. Some people would be left with the unforgettable memory of finding a dead body deposited on the banks of a river. Volunteer organizations like the Red Cross and the Salvation Army stepped in to provide food and shelter for flood victims. The Christie's Cookie Company provided free bread, and Bell set up free phones so that people could contact friends and family. Around 2,000 airmen from the Air Force conducted search and rescue operations along the Humber River looking for survivors. The Army supplied beds, blankets, and stretchers. It had also been the job of building temporary replacements for the bridges that had been damaged or destroyed. Many of these people would work for days with only minimal sleep. Some of the most incredible work was done at Holland Marsh, where Ontario Hydro managed to drain the valley in just under a month. This was farming country, and the 1955 harvest would be especially good because of the mineral-rich sediments left behind by the floodwaters.
81 Canadians would die as a result of Hurricane Hazel, mostly in the GTA. Some of the bodies would never be recovered as they were washed into Lake Ontario. The federal government compiled Canadian disaster statistics and estimated that the modern-day cost of the storm would be a little more than $1 billion. To prevent similar disasters in the future, the Metro Toronto and Region Conservation Authority was created, controlling every river system entering Lake Ontario from Etobicoke to Pickering, and responsible for flood management. Today, the Conservation Authority manages 12 dams, 9 flood control channels, and 6 dikes across the GTA. Hundreds of other flood prevention and erosion control projects have also been carried out over the years, though some people argue that it's still not enough, and overdevelopment in some areas may lead to the same problem if a similar storm strikes. 26,000 acres of land in heavily flooded areas was expropriated, and policies were adopted to prevent home construction and other development projects in ravines or floodplains. As an American engineer said, "When we are honest with ourselves and get down to the bottom of the flood problem, about 90% of the permanent flood damage is the result of building roads, railways, factories, homes, farms, and whatnot on land that properly belonged to the river." Most of the expropriated land would be turned into parkland that millions of people visit every year. The land where Raymore Drive was washed away has been turned into Raymore Park, which contains a footbridge over the Humber dedicated to the people who died.
We have one final note. If you were wondering what happened to the woman called Hurricane Hazel, when confronted with the storm called Hurricane Hazel, she was 23 years old and living in Streetsville. She said, "The night of the storm, I went to bed. The next morning, the hydro was out, trees were knocked down, debris was piled up. We wandered the streets looking for a way to get around the trees lying across the roads. Police stood up on the street corners guiding traffic, but it was a mess." So guys, that was the episode. I'm glad you stuck around and got to learn another fascinating Toronto history moment. This is the Muddy York. Today, we talked a lot about things you can find on our Facebook and Twitter pages. So Adam, why don't you tell the good people where they can find that?
You can find our Twitter page at Toronto_history and our Facebook page at Muddy York History, all one word. If you'd like to send us an email, our email is muddy_york@outlook.com. Thanks again for listening. Our next episode will be about the history of basketball in Toronto, including the fact that Toronto was one of the original cities in the NBA. Bet you probably didn't know that. We'll hear back from you in 2 weeks.
Stay tuned and please give us 5 stars, share it with your friends, leave us a review. It's how great people like you find out about the podcast. So keep sharing it and we'll keep trying to bring you great contact. Have a great night. Oh, why did I say that? Hold on. Have a great night. Okay.